Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here, and indeed some people I haven't seen for a while. So it's always interesting to see who comes to these events, and it's great. I'm really looking forward to this event this evening. But before we get to that, I just want to thank you all for joining us. This is the second last College of Asia and the Pacific Professorial Lecture for 2024, but don't worry, there's another round of promotions later this year, so we'll have some more next year. As you know, the series honours and celebrates the extraordinary achievements of our colleagues who have been recently promoted to Professor. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Helen Sullivan. I have the very great honour of being the Dean of this amazing college. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge, celebrate and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose traditional lands we work and live, and to pay my respects to them and to all First Nations Australians and to any other First Nations people who are with us this evening. So, back to tonight. I asked Sinclair if there was anything embarrassing he didn't want me to say, but he trumped me on that one, so I'm not going to reveal the embarrassing thing, but trust me, there'll be something. And if there isn't, you can blame him. So this evening's event is celebrating Professor Sinclair Dinnen's contribution to research and teaching at the college. Some of you will know, Professor Dinnen's based at the Department of Pacific Affairs in the Coral Bell School of Asian Pacific Affairs. He has long-standing research interests in regulatory pluralism, comparative criminology, justice and policing, conflict and peace building, post-colonial state formation and development studies. He also had a life, as many people do in this college, pre-academia. Quite a life, I think. And so he came to academia with perhaps fewer preconceptions than some people do. He has many extraordinary qualities. He is an incredibly collegiate individual, and he is also one of those people that literally has to be dragged kicking and screaming into things like promotions processes. So it was not an easy job to get him to apply. Of course, once he applied, it was a very easy job for the committee to promote him. And one of my hopes is that Sinclair will use his experience to mentor and support younger colleagues who may themselves be quite self-effacing and backward in coming forward, because I think it's very, very important that our colleagues get good role modelling and good mentoring, including from those people who do not necessarily see themselves as always being at the front of the queue. So I have particular pleasure in introducing Sinclair this evening. There will be an opportunity after Sinclair has spoken for you to ask questions, and then as usual, we will have a small celebration outside that I really hope you can stay for. So Sinclair's lecture this evening will explore the significance and impact of community-initiated governance and regulatory experimentation on larger processes of state and nation-making in contemporary Melanesia. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Sinclair Dinnen to the lectern.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed, Helen, and let me also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land who are meeting this evening and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, past, present and emerging. Thank you all for coming, particularly given the inclemency of the weather. It's great to see you. I've been feeling a little bit sort of daunted by the prospect of this evening, but as it's got nearer, I've realised that I'll just treat it as I treat other sort of lectures and try and give you, in this case, a sort of broad indication of the kind of research that I've been involved in over a sort of period of time, but with a particular focus on this topic here. The presentation is sort of ordered as follows. I may or may not stick to that ordering. I'm not very good at following outlines, but I'm going to talk about sort of order making, what it means in the sort of countries, the areas where I'm looking at, both past and present, because order making is obviously a sort of continuous process, not a one-off process. I'll also be then looking at some of the examples of order making that we and myself have been looking at more recently, and then some sort of concluding thoughts. You know, what does this all mean? What is the significance? Okay, where and what am I talking about? I sort of work and have worked mainly in sort of Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. You know, we are talking about an extraordinarily diverse sort of sub-region of the larger Pacific. And in terms of characterizing it, very difficult to characterize. It's a region of enormous diversity, both, you know, between countries, but also within them. And from the point of view of a scholar like myself, the interesting, the really sort of fascinating thing about that is pluralism. It's about, you know, different forms of order, different forms of regulation, sort of interacting, coming together, and looking at that sort of complexity as it sort of plays out in those different sort of places. And I mean, one of the, you know, obvious sort of distinctions is between sort of state-based order and much more sort of local-based orders and how these sort of interact. It's also a region that is undergoing extraordinary sort of transformations, many of which are extremely painful in the context of sort of globalization and the sort of dislocations and the forms of economic marginalization that go with these processes, many of which you will be familiar with in other areas where you work. It is also a place where there is remarkable resilience and adaptability and innovation on display at really all levels, but at the level that I'm looking at a level of community, at the most local levels, which is also often the one that is least visible. And there's a tendency, obviously, to sort of focus at the higher level. By local order making, I mean, it's really how people create enduring, stable, and routinized life in these diverse communities. It's how they manage everyday disputation, security, safety, and conflict. And order making speaks to a number of things. It speaks to that sort of resilience and adaptability and dynamism, which I'm going to be talking about, but it also speaks to growing stresses that I just mentioned that are occurring and that are often not well addressed by more formal sort of institutions and responses. I should also say that this sort of draws on ongoing research, which is part of a discovery project with my incredible colleague, RegNet's Miranda Forsyth. But it also is an opportunity, as I said, to reflect on some research that's been going on for quite some time. I should also, I think, at the start say a little bit about myself, where I come from, how I got into this kind of work. And this is where the embarrassing event will shortly occur. But I came to Papua New Guinea, not to Australia. I came to Papua New Guinea from England, where I was based. My background was, in terms of tertiary education, was sort of a law degree in Scottish law, not particularly helpful beyond Scotland, but also criminology. And I had developed an interest in law and development. In England, I actually met up with quite a well-known UK-based Australian scholar called Peter Fitzpatrick, who wrote a book about law and state in Papua New Guinea, and encouraged me to think about Papua New Guinea as a place to go to look at some of the sort of issues that I was interested in. So from there, I applied for a job and ended up at the law school at UPNG. And there I went as a teacher, but I ended up very much as a student and learned a lot from the students who were there, a lot more than I think they ever learned from me. But that began a process of learning. It was also transformational in both a personal and professional sense. And at that period, I was also involved in sort of traveling around sort of Papua New Guinea, visiting students, but I also had a trip to Solomon Islands, and this is the embarrassing bit. This is from deep in the last century. I won't tell you exactly when, but I suppose my first experience of an order-making venture, which was going along with a team from UPNG to teach a course to police prosecutors at the Police Training College in Honiara. And on my right, my good friend Rimbing Pato, who some of you from PNG will know about, PNG's longest serving foreign minister. He did a lot better than I ever did. And he left academia and went into politics. And on his right, John Nonga, who became a very prominent public lawyer in Papua New Guinea and a professor of law. But anyway, from there, I came to the ANU, did the PhD, going back to PNG to do that. I want to move now into the order-making side of things, which is really my lecture. And order-making, I said, is a sort of continuous process. And in PNG, as in many other sort of Pacific colonies, as they were, there was a great deal of experimentation that went on during colonial times with different forms of governance. We often sort of talk about it in terms of indirect rule, where very small colonial administrations engage with the local in particular ways, and in ways that often involve sort of hybrid forms of governance. And some of the sort of local level order making that I will be looking at in the contemporary context, has its antecedents in some of those sort of colonial forms of experimentation, not only undertaken by colonial states, but also engaged in by local communities, often in opposition to sort of colonialism and colonial impositions in the form of oppositional social movements in the Solomon Islands, like, for example, Messina Rule, which adopted many sort of different forms as a kind of alternate to as an alternate to the sort of colonial state. So what I'm talking about has a long history, and I'm talking about it primarily not as a kind of colonial modality of governance, but as a sort of contemporary modality of governance in the very different sort of context of the contemporary Melanesian countries. That sort of hybrid experimentation or experimentation with hybrid forms of government at the state level came to an end with decolonisation. That was a process of modernisation, institutional modernisation, and despite some of the aspirations of public intellectuals and places like PNG, Bernard Narakobi, who was really talking about developing sort of hybrid forms of governance to inform the development of the new independent state. The state that emerged was really a kind of template state with sort of institutions sort of, very similar to those to be found in Australia. And that included sort of policing and justice institutions that were sort of quite separate from administration, operating through separation of powers and everything. And that period, which went on for a long time in all of the countries of what we now call Melanesia, were often experienced in terms of a withdrawal of state from rural areas, as the older forms of sort of district level administration were sort of clawed back and centralized sort of systems replaced them. Those centralized systems often didn't get very far beyond the national capitals and the few sort of provincial capitals. And so they were experienced often in terms of state withdrawal. And what has always surprised me in parts of the Highlands and parts of Solomon Islands as well is the articulation of a colonial nostalgia. And of course, it is a nostalgia, often being expressed by people who were, weren't there, who didn't experience things firsthand. And that nostalgia speaks more to the contemporary sort of experience of absence of government or government working in particular ways. Okay, so moving on, we are now in a sort of situation where concerns about crime, violence and insecurity are really very much in focus, particularly in Papua New Guinea, but more broadly across the region. PNG is seen very much as the sort of extreme case, and these are just some newspaper headlines from this year alone. But there have also been significant conflicts in Bougainville and Solomon Islands. And the broader context is the one that I mentioned briefly: social dislocation, globalization, and significant economic marginalization. A lot of sort of very complex sort of issues and significant challenges to the consolidation of state. And often the language that is used now around sort of state failure is really misleading for a whole lot of reasons. But one, because it assumes that the state was consolidated at one point and was sort of working. Well, that has never been the case. And so problems of consolidation are very, very significant. And a lot of the external framings that, again, people in an audience like this will probably be familiar with have focused very much around the need to strengthen these states, now talked about more in terms of fragility, and policing and justice are really critical to those sort of approaches adopted by Australia, but by a number of other countries that are quite active in terms of, donors and international partners. And part of the problem with that is I'm not sort of saying that there isn't a need to sort of work in those areas, is that it's a predominantly state-centric view that sort of ignores other sort of forms of security, other conceptions of security, and in particular, other forms of security governance that have been around for a long, long time and that continue to evolve and develop in these contexts. And it's very rare to sort of find those state-centric notions actually challenged. But a quote that I am very fond of using comes from an very early review of law and order in Papua New Guinea, where the writers of the report basically pointed out that you may be looking at the wrong place. You may be basically sort of concentrating on a sort of institutional form whose relevance is sort of questionable in terms of some of the problems that you're trying to address. And then just this week, I saw this other fairly unusual manifestation of similar sentiments and similar analysis in a really excellent piece by Nick McClellan. But that's largely sort of exceptional. Okay, so that is my segue, if you like, into order making beneath the state or around the state or on the edges of the state. It's really sort of going away from the sort of fairly narrow focus on policing and justice as a way of sort of responding to these massively complex and diverse sort of social forces that are sort of contributing to significant harm, damage, and evidence of sort of dysfunction in those countries, to really go down to a much more sort of basic level, rudimentary level, community level, to look at how those communities respond to the same sort of pressures that are being experienced elsewhere. Okay, local level order making. Often entails, again, sort of hybrid sort of forms of governance and approaches to the managing of security, safety, and everyday problems. And in that picture, I try to sort of represent where these sort of different sources of authority sort of lie. So you have a courthouse up there, the state, you have the church, and then you have the community-based sort of approaches. And across the region, you see different configurations of these different sources and different actors sort of operating together or sometimes against each other. And again, as I said, there are significant sort of colonial antecedents to this sort of pattern as it plays out. And you see a lot of local problem solving that is occurring in that sort of context, with a very strong focus on addressing community breakdown. And community breakdown is a very real phenomenon, I think, in many parts of the region, in Papua New Guinea in particular, but also in parts of the Solomon Islands where some of this work has been undertaken. And there are real sort of efforts, sometimes not so successful, sometimes not so virtuous, but efforts going on at that local level to try and address this problem of breakdown. And an example is taken from some research that I was involved in, again with a number of colleagues in the Solomon Islands and a few from the ANU about 10 years ago, which involved a study of communities across 5 of the Solomon Islands' 9 provinces, looking at working in sort of rural communities and basically asking people in those communities about how they managed everyday disputation, how they managed these sort of growing stresses in areas where the state had a very limited or very intermittent sort of presence, where it was very difficult to access the police if that was the way you wanted to go, very difficult to access a court. And the Solomon Islands has a slightly different sort of history of state withdrawal in that after independence in Solomon Islands, which was in 1978, some of those local level systems that had been put in initially in the period of late colonialism were carried over. And you had sort of a system of local level governance that was based around something called an area council that continued to operate for about 15 years. And those local area councils had sort of justice dimensions to them. That was where local courts were attached. They also had a figure called an area constable. So there was an area of regulation from the state that actually operated at those very local levels. But those systems began to be eroded 10, 15 years after independence, largely because of the creation of discretionary funds given to MPs, members of parliament, who also sort of saw these local level government systems as potential sources of political rivals. And then along comes the ADB in the Asian financial crisis, imposes a structural adjustment program. And that's the end of local councils. So suddenly state withdrawal is experienced and being articulated in a way in Solomon Islands much later than it was in a place like PNG. But the study sort of revealed that there were the three overlapping regulatory systems operating at local level. There was kind of bit of state, often. There were sort of church actors, but there was also the custom system. It's not really a custom system. It's kind of community norms as these had evolved and developed. And these sort of systems operated together, but sometimes not so well together. And the study also found that none of those systems was particularly effective. They were all sort of breaking down for different reasons. And one of the most significant reasons, I mean, the state system was absent, so that was the reason it wasn't working particularly well. It was just very difficult to access. The customary system was under enormous pressure, largely through political economy developments, and in particular the logging industry, which was sort of coming into areas, dividing communities, and the sort of custodians of those systems were often the ones that were targeted by the logging companies. So they were taken off to the nearest town, put up in the hotel, and that was the sort of end of the sort of customary system. If you take away the sort of leadership, that sort of system sort of breaks down. And each of those systems were viewed as having a potentially valuable role to play in terms of disputation and dealing with sort of conflict. The customs system very much in terms of socially embedded forms of disputation, say around land, where knowledge of genealogies was really important. And really it was the sort of local experts in terms of those with that knowledge who were in a much better position than, say, the state to deal with those issues. For a lot of the people that we were talking to, the sort of church-based system was seen as much better for dealing with issues like family sort of disputes, and was certainly one that seemed to be preferred by a lot of women. But there was also a strong desire for this state system to return in some form or other. And what we saw was a lot of experimentation in sort of writing down laws, in establishing committees, none of which was particularly new in itself, but just a sort of efflorescence of experimentation and activity at these very local levels, part of which was probably to do with attracting the state back. It was like almost a kind of inverse of sort of James C. Scott sort of seeing like a state. If communities made themselves look like a state by having its own laws, by having its own sort of committee system, then maybe something that looked like a state or saw like a state would come back and sort of connect. There were lots of other sort of dimensions to what's going on. A lot of it was just problem solving. How do we solve this problem? Because these systems are sort of breaking down. But extensive experimentation, and a lot of it around building community. And I think a very clear realization, and this came across in discussions and has come across in discussions elsewhere, that when communities start breaking down, small problems have a tendency to become big. The whole issue of conflict escalation, and many people in the Solomon Islands seeing the tension, which is widely understood, the conflict that occurred in the Solomon Islands from 1998 to 2003, as an ethnic tension. But many people who you talk to in the Solomon Islands, they say it was really about the breakdown of community in certain areas and the inability to deal with small problems and stop them from escalating. You also hear similar things elsewhere. And so there was, I think, an acknowledgement that addressing community breakdown was absolutely critical. None of that has ever really been on the agenda of states, or for that matter, donors who are much more focused on state building. And state building often entails a sort of fairly narrow focus on institutions of state. So that's where community building sort of becomes really sort of significant in terms of thinking about state building, because one without the other often doesn't succeed. Okay, the other thing that came out of this research was that while people wanted, by and large, much better connectivity with these sort of state systems which had abandoned them, and they wanted to bring them back, they wanted to maintain high levels of local autonomy. You come back on our terms. You know, we want to be in the driving seat, we just need some assistance. So that was another sort of striking example. Okay, let's look at a few examples. These are both from different sort of communities in the Solomon Islands. The first one up there you probably can't read, but it's very, very detailed. A lot of it is about dress code, a lot of it is about things that sort of reflect this very small community is a church-based community. It's really an extended family, about 150 people who have their founder and are really, really sort of into this particular sort of Pentecostal sort of community. And they've sort of created a bit of a bubble and operate within this bubble. And at either side of the community, when you come in, you face this sort of notice board telling you the do's and don'ts in that particular community. Ambu, down below, is a much larger sort of peri-urban community. And you just get a sort of sense of the kind of rules there. And I mean, the notice boards aren't all the rules, they're just, a sample of those rules. Often the rule making, and we'll say a little bit how these rules are made, are sort of focused on safety issues, community safety issues, but there are, strong elements around sort of morality. And again, it reflects, what is the dominant authority, source of authority in this particular community? Is it the church? Is it the sort of policeman that lives here, the state, the bit of state? Or is it, the traditional leaders who are still fairly active? So you get sort of different nuances in these sort of rules depending on where you go. They have absolutely no official status, legal status in law. They are often performative, displayed in these sort of notice boards. And sometimes, as we shall see, there are significant inputs from external actors. Could be the community police in a sort of peri-urban area where the police do have a presence, and often that's sort of around crime prevention. And often very legalistic sort of rules that one wonders if anyone has read, apart from the sort of police who are sort of leading them. And then in other sort of places you have NGOs, Save the Children, who might be doing something around child protection. So you have a lot of sort of focus on those kinds of rules. And a sort of category of people that Miranda and I have recently wrote a little piece about, long-distance leaders. And these are leaders who don't live in the community, but they live in the national capital, highly educated, and they're on their phones all the time, sort of trying to sort out these sort of problems back home. So these are also significant shapers of these rules. Okay, the rules themselves, as I said, the ones that you get on the notice board are only, 5 out of, 72 rules. So when you actually go to the rules themselves, you also see, up here, you just see the content of the sort of sections. They do tend to be sort of fairly comprehensive in what they're trying to manage. And they often include significant, sort of governance arrangements, committees for this, that, and the next thing, and this is how we make the rules, this is what happens to you if you break the rules, and this is how you might appeal against, in some cases where there are appeals. There are also efforts made to try and validate these rules, even although they have no legal status. So that often involves going to the provincial police commander and getting to sign off on rules that have absolutely no status whatsoever. Even sometimes, the provincial secretary. These rules from Malaita province, the Malaitan provincial government is now looking at these reviews and sort of, in a way, soliciting communities to pass their rules by them, and they go through the legal sort of department and get signed off. So the kind of creeping formalisation occurring, even although these rules have no status. Here's an example from a sort of urban community, again in Solomon Islands in Honiara. And it's just an indication of the sort of detail in there. And I've just sort of highlighted the sort of family and domestic sort of violence elements. It really sort of covers a whole lot of issues, and you can see all the different influences sort of coming in there, including those of sort of external groups. This one, which you won't be able to read, comes from a Motu Koita village, which is a traditional sort of landowning village in Port Moresby, the sprawling sort of city of possibly up to 1 million people, where the indigenous landowners are gradually, being swallowed up by everything that is sort of happening around them. And a lot of the rules there are to do with land. They are to do with settlers, squatters, and also to do with landowners who are illegally trying to sell their land to these people. There are provisions in there for evicting people from the community. So again, the rules sort of reflect these local sort of issues and the kind of things that they have to do. These two are from, again, a completely different space. These are from Fiji, from urban Suva, the Suva-Nasori sort of corridor. And they are basically rules that were sort of formulated by the community police. The Fiji sort of police, which is very, very active in many sort of urban areas, but also some rural areas as well. So you just have a listing of sort of offences. The kind of issues that were significant for members of the community in both those places was the precarity of their tenancy. There were people who had come in from the outer islands. They were scared about, getting into trouble if the youngsters in their community did something terrible, and they all ended up sort of getting kicked out. But there was a lot of sort of activity going on there, and again, some very significant input. Very, very different set of rules here in relation to parts of the PNG highlands. Very, very sort of challenging sort of contacts. And in both these places, this is from Jiwaka and this is from Simbu, you have sort of communities that have been deeply damaged by long-term fighting that has been going on, sorcery, accusation-related violence. And in the Gore case, you actually have the community through sort of consultations, again with a number of fairly significant external brokers, setting up their own police force in order, and their own sort of system of laws that the police force were supposed to enforce, directed largely at preventing sort of conflict from recurring and addressing sort of problems of violence. Again, with very sort of mixed results, but the official police also sort of involved in providing some assistance. Okay, so, I mean, apart from the rules, if we leave the rules to one side, what is important here is a process that is sort of going on in those very, very different communities. Because the rules are often the consequence of lots of meetings, lots of discussions. It's a sort of dialogic sort of process of rulemaking, which in many respects is much more important than the actual rules themselves. Those rules cannot really be enforced. They depend on community cohesion. The reason the rules are being made is because cohesion is sort of falling down. And so there are often very, very real issues around cohesion, around enforcement. And the rules are often sort of performative, but they come out of these dialogic sort of processes of making rules. And the committees that are sort of established to, if you like, administer those rules remain. They continue to sort of operate. So you have these creations, these new spaces for a discussion around many of these sort of issues. And many of the sort of discussions, again, are less about the content of the rules and more about establishing linkages outside of the community with people who might be able to help with this, that, or that particular problem. So again, it's about reaching out beyond the local to those sort of broader administrative systems that may or may not sort of exist. Okay, there are obviously all manner of problems in relation to these kind of processes. If we think of them in terms of, law enforcement, in terms of enforcing rules that might be profoundly sort of inequitable and so on. And obviously issues around gender, about local sort of power relations, human rights and so on. And these are the kind of things that tend to keep external actors away from these sort of processes. But what we're actually sort of finding in a number of the sort of places where we've been working is extraordinary levels of adaptability, flexibility, openness to sort of changing and introducing sort of, really quite non-traditional sort of approaches. And as I said, I mean, the sort of, to me, one of the most significant aspects of what's going on there is about linking to these external systems, and that's where the potential for accountability and other forms of regulation sort of lie. There is also the significant role of external actors like NGOs and so on. Order making of a slightly different sort of kind is happening in Bougainville. And I'd like to acknowledge Dennis Kuai, who's currently a Pacific visitor with DPA, who's been very much involved in what has been happening in Bougainville. And I think Bougainville is a really interesting case where you had this entire collapse of government over a 10-year period because of the crisis. And a process of rebuilding that entailed not going back to what existed before, but an attempt to sort of reformulate and redesign and repurpose institutions so that they would actually fit Bougainville's sort of particular needs and circumstances. And a lot of that has happened in the law and justice space. And what you see, putting it very crudely, because we don't have time to sort of talk about it in any detail, is the emergence and institutionalization of hybrid forms of justice and governance in post-conflict Bougainville, which reflect, amongst other things, a desire to do things differently and not go back to old ways. A recognition of sort of local strengths to some extent, and also a recognition of the importance of community. Because, again, Bougainville was sort of put in the secessionist box as a kind of conflict. But much of the Bougainville crisis was about conflict between Bougainvilleans. And that was also about the breakdown of community that occurred over a very, very long period of time. And so the processes of rebuilding have had that community building focus very much to the fore. And that is now reflected in, it's still a system that is sort of folding out of community government, which Karen has written about, amongst others, which is remarkable of for really any place in the Pacific for its sort of gender equity provisions in terms of representation. So although these hybrid systems are sort of drawing on different things, they are also able to, certainly in the case of Bougainville, contain sort of quite surprising issues. I mean, the gender equity provision is that chairs of community governments have to, change if they're a man. With the next electoral cycle, they have to be a woman. So you actually have, a significant shift that has been occurring there. And the justice and policing are increasingly embedded in these sort of community government systems. I'll skip that and move very quickly to some concluding thoughts. These examples, which I won't sort of talk about, are again some, I think, sort of practical examples that sort of come out of this sort of order-making experimentation in terms of officials or mechanisms that look very different to the sort of state-centric sort of systems that sort of preceded them, and that are much more tailored to sort of dealing with some of the issues that are being experienced. And they're really about developing horizontal linkages at the sort of community level between these different sources of authority, and then vertical ones rather, to connect up to state. And so you have figures like the community auxiliary police that were a new form of policing that was created in post-conflict Bougainville, that operate very closely with local leadership, initially through the Council of Elders, and now through these sort of community government sort of mechanisms. And in Solomon Islands, you have something very similar that was in fact inspired by the Bougainville CAPs, that has evolved and morphed into something very interesting, but which began with someone called the community officer, who in many respects resembles the old area constable. That is their role, that kind of liaison, the linking, and much of their time is not, kind of law enforcement, not kind of policing, although that's often, how they're presented. It's governance that they're involved in. They're operating as sort of significant figures in helping the sort of reordering that is sort of going on and connecting to the external actors. Okay, so closing things down so that we have some time, and this has been done at a ridiculous pace, so it's fairly sort of superficial, but the sort of messages that I would sort of bring out of this is that there's a really powerful order-making impulse that is evident at local levels across the region that is often simply not seen. There is widespread experimentation going on, again, which is simply often not seen. There are very creative usages of and appeals to custom, to religion, which are really important in terms of, as a source of local strength. But these are being used in very fluid and adaptable ways. It's not a sort of back to the future thing, which is, where the donors and the state sort of throw up their hands in horror, we don't want to go anywhere near this. These are remarkably sort of adaptable. And we've found, and I'm sure many of you, doing similar work have found that chiefs are often the first ones who really want to be trained. They want to know about human rights. They want to go off and train. I mean, it's in their interest to do so. They're not stupid. They realise that this is actually a very important way to go if they are going to sort of continue. I mean, that's putting it very cynically, and my apologies. But they're very, very open to doing things in very different ways. There is also this appreciation that, the activity that is going on in these local areas, which is virtually invisible from elsewhere, has lots of lessons that should be being learnt by those that are operating in the more formal sector at the level of state. There is a lot of learning going on across between communities, and we've seen that contagion. Community A hears about what's happening in community B, they go for a visit, they find out about these things, and then they begin to perhaps adopt some of these things and tailor them to their own needs, but very little vertical sort of learning going on, which is a great shame. Now, these systems are also sort of highly vulnerable for all the reasons that we've mentioned, including the increasing sort of challenges that are being presented to the legitimacy of local leaders. Coming from DPA, it is programmed in our DNA that we have to come out with policy implications, something I find very, very difficult, I have to admit. But if we are to think of, what does this all mean in terms of sort of policy? Well, I mean, some very broad implications might be these. First, the need to acknowledge and support local knowledge and expertise. The need, I think, to also, get behind the more organic forms of order making that are taking place, as opposed to the community police coming in with a set of 205 rules and detailed regulations and so on about how to administer those rules. That does happen. And the moment the police leave, the thing just sort of folds up. So following the organic sort of processes, they tend to have the longevity. The other sort of point, again, which I've talked about earlier on, is that in terms of the larger conflicts, including those that are currently happening in the PNG highlands, in places like Enga and in the Southern Highlands, often these start with the most parochial forms of disputation. And yet there appears to be no sort of system in place that can stop that from sort of growing. So in a way, the sort of community building and the local order making is addressing or trying to address that sort of absence. And this is why potentially there's a lot to learn from these kinds of approaches. And the other ones I'll just sort of leave you with and conclude this talk, Helen, and pass it back to you.